Challenges of elections without campaign finance law. And I would now like to invite Mr. Sanjana Hattotur to speak on new media and election integrity.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me to begin with? Wonderful. So I have about 15 to 20 minutes to cover what is impossible to in that time period. And it's also an ungodly hour here in New Zealand. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, so forgive me for being somewhat incoherent occasionally. I want to read an excerpt and then get those who are joining the live stream to see whether they can place it or date it. And I quote, "In a less positive development, websites were also used by supporters of the president and to a lesser extent, the oppositional candidate to spread defamatory allegations and rumors about their candidate's opponent. There were reports that websites masquerading as official websites had published negative allegations about one candidate, while it was reported that on a particular date in January that another website had been hacked into, the UNP website, and a fake opinion poll resulting in predicting a loss for the UNP's opponent had been published. A variety of unsubstantiated rumors, including about the house arrest of a candidate, the commissioner of elections, was also spread a day before the election, while initial results were being announced. All this was done via SMS with the possible intent of inflaming emotions. Now, this seems to be something that comes out of the 2019 presidential election or the 2020 parliamentary election, but it's in fact from 10 years ago, in fact, more than 10 years ago. This is from the 2010 presidential election. I have been studying electoral manipulation using what is now called social or new media for a very long time. So in one sense, this is not new for the country. In another sense, however, after 2012 in particular, with the use and adoption and adaptation of social media through the devices we have in our hands, which is the mobile phone, there is a very interesting story around how political entrepreneurs, politicians, and their powerful proxies, instrumentalized social media to help campaigns in particular. Now, that story I can't tell because I have too little time. It is, however, a very interesting story for one very interesting reason, particularly for those from the West who are joining us, and it is that Sri Lanka was a harbinger of every single thing that you saw leading up to Brexit, the 2016 presidential election across the Atlantic in the United States leading to the election of Trump, all of what happened in the 4 years since, and indeed what happened leading up to the violent insurrection of Capitol Hill on January 6th this year. That is the kind of toxicity that you saw leading up to elections in Sri Lanka, and the abuse or the instrumentalization or the weaponization of platforms for a number of years. Of course, the likes of Facebook only ever took it seriously when their own markets in their own home countries and home turf were being impacted. So in that sense, political entrepreneurs and their powerful proxies have been... Sarah, you'll have to mute your mic.
Yeah, but then they have to bring you out. I think you should do that now.
Sarah, Sarah, mute your mic, Sarah. Cheers. I'm glad you joined, Sarah. We were worried whether you wouldn't be able to make it. So going back to it, I mean, that's a story that I think is a very, very interesting story that needs to be written and partly has been captured in what has been produced by the forum by my two distinguished colleagues and I in a document that is now with CMEV, looking at the kind of challenges that both are to be found globally and worldwide, and also in Sri Lanka. So just to kind of capture, I suppose, for the purpose of this discussion, what the landscape is at the present moment, just so that we are on the same page. One of the concerns I have is that electoral monitoring bodies, EMBs, civil society, independent election monitors, and observers of the election, including journalists in Sri Lanka, are still not fit for purpose. The nature of challenges have grown at pace. And I think partly the cruel joke about all of this is that when CMEV or when any other electoral monitoring body independently comes up with things like campaign spending, they might have the last laugh. And I know they have the last laugh because I think we all have, backdoor channels into some of these political entrepreneurs and their campaigns. And the spend is actually significantly more, as was hinted at by the earlier speaker. But this is particularly the case around social media. And one divergence I take with the previous speaker is that I don't think that the increase is because of the pandemic. I think that the pandemic accelerated what is our future anyway. And it brought forward in August 2020 what was happening for a couple of years before, including leading up to the presidential election in November 2019, and would have invariably and inevitably happened in the future as well. So, what is really going on? And that's a bit complex to talk about in this kind of forum where the audience is extremely diverse. But in a sense, there is a lot that's happening in the manipulation of media. Now, I'm not going to use, I think CMEVs use this term social or new media. It doesn't make any sense. Nobody uses it anymore. Let's just call it media. People like Nalaka, even in Sri Lanka, have been on the same page. Nobody uses the term social media anymore because, particularly in a country like Sri Lanka, it just does not make any sense whatsoever. Other than news first, all of the broadcast and print media is up on Facebook. What's up on Facebook goes up on print. What's on print goes in broadcast. What's on broadcast gets spliced and diced and goes up in shorter segments onto Facebook. What's on Facebook goes on to YouTube, and something that's on YouTube is reported on in the mainstream broadcast media. So, it's just media. Let's just call it media. And one of the things is that there is an increasing sophistication in the manipulation of it that outpaces the ability of many in the country to track it accurately. Now, I can't give you an accurate readout in the limited time that I have, but there are some interesting things that are going on. One is that if you're just talking about Facebook, there are, and this is all data because I'm doing doctoral research into this, and so I have monitored very carefully what happened in 2019, which is a part of a chapter of my thesis, and also what happened in 2020. There's a lot that's going on. I mean, some of it is actually a bit funny when you go to think of it. So when I looked at 2020, I discovered on average about 30 pages per candidate. And so there are, just upwards of 200 official pages in Parliament that I track. But that goes up to about 600 pages at the very minimum, because you have, on average, about a dozen pages per member of Parliament. And they go like Sanjana Hattaruge Yaluwo, Rappalaning Sanjana Hattatuwa, Sanjana Hatturu Dinamamu, Sanjana Hatturu Janadipati, Sanjana Hatturu Janadipati, Vissa Visihatara, Visihatara Sanjana Hattatu, Sanjana Hatturu Tarunayanta Tarunayangi Samajiki Sanjana Hatturu, and so on and so forth. So you have all of these permutations for the Western friends. These are all permutations of a particular candidate's names, associated with various ways in which they are promoted. And all these are pages, all of these pages are running advertisements, all of these pages are proxy pages, not officially affiliated or associated with the particular candidate. And the problem there is that every single report, including CMEV, that I've seen in the country only ever deals with a limited number of pages, and possibly only the official page of the candidate. And the irony being that the official page of a candidate will probably run the least amount of ads and will be the most well-behaved, when there's a whole concert of proxy pages that are visible, that are doing all the nefarious activities, including running advertisements within the cooling period. It's actually quite dangerous. So the funny bit apart, because you're looking at the sophisticated manipulation of an electorate well before a campaign. It's every day. That is also something that I think that lots of people don't get. CMEV talks about campaigns leading up to election day, say for 2 months prior to it. Every single day, I've been studying it from 2018, there is some sort of an electoral context. There is a hyper partisan, deeply political conversation taking place, but it's not taking place on the pages of the political parties or the candidates. Sri Lanka's media ecology is rather complicated. The Western colleagues who are on this call may recognize it as junk news pages. So in Sri Lanka, we call it gossip pages. Gossip pages are bought over by political candidates and political parties during a campaign for quite princely sums of money now. But every day there is some sort of a campaign. So it's now Sarath Fonseca or Vimal Veeravansa or Basil Rajapaksa or Gotabaya or Mahinda Rajapaksa, or it's within a family, or it's between family members, or it's between various factions within a party, or it's between parties. So it's really very complicated. It's actually quite fascinating to look at. But what's a bit disturbing is that it's increasingly targeting a demographic that is pre-franchise, so below 18 years of age. And again, I don't have time to go into this, but what it's doing is that it's determining the nature of politics through a hyper-partisan lens, which is, of course, a problem that we have in the country. So often speakers mix up and conflate partisan with the political. And so when people are, or when the pre-franchise demographic is introduced to the nature of politics in the country, it's usually through a hyper-partisan lens. And so that is a problem, the nature of which I think bears further reflection and study. So I'm going to end by just talking a little bit about, and Manjula wanted me to talk about some of these aspects as well. One of the things, listen, I'm simplifying it a lot. As I said, we don't have time to talk about it, but one of the things that we see very, very clearly mirroring what's happening globally is that a lot of the political conversation, the hyper-partisan conversation, is moving to instant messaging like WhatsApp or Viber or even Facebook Messenger, which precludes easy study by researchers like myself because it's what you would call one-to-one or one-to-many. It's encrypted, it's private, it's not in any public domain necessarily. And so people can do whatever they want under the cloak of privacy and without adequate scrutiny, including by EMBs. And that is actually happening at pace. Another very disturbing phenomenon that we saw in 2020 in particular, but also leading up to the presidential election in 2019 is apps. Now that's a whole different conversation in Sri Lanka. Extremely disturbing. There were a number of apps that were launched. They are their own ecosystem, zero privacy, harvesting information, listening into microphone conversations, logging the what you call the telemetry data of the mobile phones that they were installed on. Really bizarre, disturbing, Orwellian things were happening with these apps. And of course, the EMB in Sri Lanka has zero awareness, has no clue, hasn't even begun to think about, leave aside, regulate these kinds of developments. So there is no oversight, there's no regulatory oversight, there's no imagination, there's no technical capacity, and the entrepreneurs in politics are having their last laugh. A lot of this is happening under, I don't know how much this has been discussed and how much Sarah will discuss this, but it's happening under a particular timber of presidency, and it's happening under a militarized country and a militarized government. And a lot of what we see day to day is very heavy militarization of the discourse as well. So just to give you an example, early 2020, when there was talk about bringing back the old parliament to deal with the pandemic, there was a lot of weaponization and instrumentalization in the first 6 months of 2020. And this is all public documented, so it's all up there. It's public documented. Every single day there was very heavy a campaign to pitch and promote and put forward the argument that you didn't even need a parliament. All you needed was the army to rule the country. So really quite disturbing to see. And those images and those frames, every single day, it was like a tsunami was associated with the president, with a very racist discourse. And so this was the kind of timber of content that went up in relation to the general election that was held later on in August. So again, this is concentrating and editing out a lot of nuance. And in that nuance, you find that a lot of the weaponization of social media is occurring in a country that is very heavily militarized. And there's an aspect to this that I will not go into, which is around surveillance. It's extensive, it's exhaustive, and that is the one aspect to all of this that is also complementing the kind of overt social media instrumentalization. And in that regard, I think Manjula and CMEV colleagues will recall the fact that there was a former commissioner who mid 2020 went on record in the Daily Mirror saying that the army wanted access to the voter registration lists. Extremely disturbing stuff. And it is now unclear whether the army has access to that or not. But of course, for the Sri Lankans, this brings back memories into the future of what occurred in July 1983. So just to reiterate, the instrumentalization of digital media or social media or new media, whatever CME wants to call it, is happening at pace. And you're moving into IM. You're also moving into apps like TikTok. Those in Sri Lanka would be particularly aware of the fact that there are two people, two key individuals who just last month, weeks of each other, very publicly moved on to TikTok, and there's one reason for that. It's because Facebook is increasing its oversight over political advertising. That's another discussion that we can have. But because of that, and because TikTok is used by a younger demographic, they see great value in moving to a demographic that uses TikTok to communicate political messages to that demographic without the scrutiny of now what Facebook is putting any advertiser around in the country, but also globally. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. In New Zealand, for example, I also monitored the New Zealand election that was held in 2020. So the EMB in New Zealand used TikTok to actually promote civic awareness and the exercise of franchise in really cool ways. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that you have to locate what's happening elsewhere in the world into the political culture and what's happening within the nature of government and governance in Sri Lanka. That's where I think there's a lot of concern I have around the instrumentalization of even TikTok as well. So I'll end by saying this: the one way you can characterize or categorize what's happening in the country is that media now tells voters what to think about. It doesn't tell them necessarily who to vote for. So when you look at media, it seems to be a very vibrant conversation. People are disagreeing, they're fighting, they're hurling insults at each other. But the nature of politics has changed, and you see that the discourse is actually quite limited. It's circumscribed. So the targets are given, the nature of the targeting is also kind of, the vocabulary, the expression is given. So there's no real dissent, there's no real anger against what people should be angry about, which is the kind of things that CMEV has been talking about campaign finance, about transparency, about accountability, about where the money is coming from. No real conversation about any of that. And that's instrumentalized, that is constructed, that's architected. It's sophisticated to a degree that beggars belief. People aren't studying it because they don't know quite how to do it. Without exception, every single report that's come out, even including up until the August 2020 general election, has not been fit for purpose. It has been late in scrutinizing what it should be scrutinizing, and the manner, the methodology, the degree of data, the sophistication of the analysis, the degree and the depth of research has not kept at pace with what has been the nature of instrumentalization. And so a lot of the discourse in Sri Lanka is actually outmoded, outdated, and outmaneuvered by the sophistication of political entrepreneurs. It's a really dangerous situation. Either we acknowledge it and we address it and we move forward, or we don't, and we cede the space to political entrepreneurs in the context of a ENB in Sri Lanka that is no longer quite independent, and is, in my opinion, has never been fit for purpose, and is as far away as being fit for purpose as it has ever been, and will possibly be more so in the future. So that's a very, very, very quick overview of a very complicated, complex, changing, fluid dynamic around the instrumentalization of media leading up to, during, after, and every single day in the country. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanjana